I'd give it just one more minute, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman.
Sir. Well, it is 1 o'clock and I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Before we start the meeting, I have something that I need to read that we're required to during this COVID period. And it says, pursuant to the City of Roanoke Emergency Ordinance adopted by the Roanoke Valley Transportation Planning Organization, RVTPO Policy Board, on April 23rd, 2020, and 2020 Virginia Assembly Legislation H-29 enacted April 24th, 2020. The February meeting of the RVTPO will be held virtually via Zoom on Thursday, February the 25th, 2021 at 1 p.m., which is today. Under the current state of emergency and until further notice, it has been deemed unsafe to assemble a quorum of a public body in one place. Any members of the public may view and participate in the meeting through electronic means. Meeting details are listed on the second page of the agenda. All materials made available to the members will be made available to the public at the same time by posting on the RVARC website. So that's a requirement that we read that before each meeting. So now, again, I will call the meeting of the February 2021 TPO meeting to order. And agenda item number 2 is approval of the consent agenda items, which is approval of agenda and action on the January 28 TPO minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'll do the attendance.
Oh, I'm sorry. You had to do
That's
that.
okay. We're going to have to follow with every time we have a vote like that. Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Mr. Clinton? Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Mr. Jeffrey? Ms. Moon Reynolds? Mr. Fidgelowski?
Here.
Mr. North?
Here.
Mr. Radford?
Here.
Mayor Turk?
Here.
Mr. Jones? Mr. Lyles? Mr. Stovall? Mr. Stovall? It's here. Mr. King?
Here.
Mr.
Here.
Price? Okay. Mr. Price?
Here.
And Mr. Soninkler. I see him, he's just getting on, I guess. And as we make motions today, if you don't mind, could you let us jot down the person who makes the motion? That would be great. We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Strickland. And I'll just say again, welcome everyone to the meeting. Agenda item number 2 is approval of consent agenda items, which includes A, approval of agenda, and B, action on the January 28th, 2021 RVTPO minutes, which is on pages 3 through 11. I hope everyone has had an opportunity to review those, and I would be glad to take a motion for approval on that if anyone would like to do so.
Mr. Chairman, this is Mickey Johnson. I make a motion, we approve it.
Okay, motion by Mickey Johnson. Do I hear a second?
Radford, second.
Okay, David Radford makes the second. I guess we take a roll call on that, don't we?
Yes, sir. Mr.
right,
Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Fidgelowski?
Yes.
Mr. North?
Yes.
Mr. Radford?
Yes.
Mayor Turk?
Yes.
Mr. Stovall?
Yes.
Mr. King?
Yes.
Mr. Price?
Yes.
Mr. Soninkler?
Yes, and I am present.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I also want to recognize the Airport Commission has not filled the position, their representative to the TPO, and Mr. Powers, Gary Powers is with us again. He's the chair of the Airport Commission.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair, also to Wayne,
Mr. Jeffrey and Ms. Moon Reynolds just joined during that last roll call.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Brian. Okay, so we do have approval on the consent agenda. I have several remarks that I would like to make before we get into our item number 4. First, last week, the U.S. Department of Transportation announced the latest round of Infrastructure for Rebuilding America grants. That's INFRA. Localities and TPOs are eligible to apply, and the applications are due by March the 19th. Projects must be construction ready, and the grant requires a 20% match. The match funds must be provided by non-federal sources. And if you're interested in knowing more about the INFRA grant program, you can contact the staff here at the TPO or the Regional Commission. The second item that I have, last week, the state released an updated draft smart scale funding scenario. Fortunately, the projects recommended for funding in the TPO region were not affected by this update. So that was good. So that concludes my remarks. And now we can go to agenda item number 4, approval of adjustment to the Surface Transportation Block Grant. And we have Christina Finch that's going to share that with us. And you'll find that on pages 12 through 24. Ms. Finch.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. I'm going to share my screen so that we can look at the recommended changes together. If some of you will recall, at the November special called board meeting, there was a request at the end from Vice Chair North that some of the policies that had been restrictive be looked at by Mr. King and Mr. Radford. And so they were asked to work with the staff to look at the policies. And so we've done that. And specifically, we looked at the Surface Transportation Block Grant policies number 4, 5, and 9. And for the newer members, this is the pot of funds that the
She froze.
Sounds like we've lost Christina.
Yeah.
You want me to go ahead, Mr. Chairman, and continue on explaining them?
Sure, if you would like to, that would be fine, sir.
I think what Christina wanted to talk about this, the STBG stands for Surface Transportation Block Grant Funds. And because we are a transportation management area, we're one of the 4 in Virginia. That means our size, our urbanized area is over 200,000. We are allocated special funds for transportation related projects. And so we've had these funds for a number of years, and they have funded a number of different projects over the years. But at the last meeting, there were some issues that came up about the policies number 4, 5, and 9. And as Christina said, Mr. King and Mr. Radford were asked to kind of look at it. And so the staff has worked closely with, and as Mr. King knows, with VDOT, we had several meetings. We had actually a few meetings, Ken, with you, and maybe a couple hours and more, I don't know. But we worked very closely, and we came up with the recommendations. I don't know what happened to, I'm not sure what happened to Christina, because she had the recommendations on there. But you have them in your agenda packet. And if you would like to, and we marked through the changes, maybe. So if you take your agenda packet out, we can look at that, and there will be. We've talked about additionally some changes to the number 9, but I guess we will go with number 4 or 5 first of all. Under number 4, and that's what I think what Christina had on the board, you'll see the changes, that things that have been struck through, and then those that have been added. So the new policy would read as pursuant to the 2-year application process, the RVTPO will approve a financial plan of projects receiving committed or conditionally committed STBG funding. The distinction between committed versus conditionally committed funding will be made clear within the financial plan, which reflects the distribution of anticipated annual allocations among the projects for up to 7 years. The projects not yet funded within the plan may be considered in priority order during an adjustment
Hi.
cycle. Oh, I
You hear
ran
me?
out of songs to sing, Christina. So I was just reading through the changes to policy 4.
Yeah, your voice sure did change, Christina.
Okay, Eddie's so kind to let me use his office. I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry about that. So I'm clearly not able to share my screen anymore to show you the changes, but hopefully you have them in front of you in your agenda packet.
Well, I was reading the new number 4, and you can, if you want me, I can finish reading that.
Okay.
If you would like.
Just for reference, Wayne, these are on page 20 of the packet if someone
Yes.
has the packet.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. So we were talking about the projects not yet funded within the plan may be considered in priority order during an adjustment cycle if additional funding becomes available, or they will have to recompete with the new candidate projects in the next application and scoring process. If you'll notice, the next several lines are crossed out, and I guess that's essentially the new policy. Under general policy, this is number 4. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Christina can answer them. Oh, Christina, do you have any comments about 4? And I think both Mr. King and Mr. Radford were in agreement with the changes that certainly were in agreement with the changes that were made.
Yes,
Well,
I think that maybe I was cut off when I was talking about the up to 7 years. So I'm not sure if that was fully explained, but just we saw the benefit of allocating funds conditionally last summer so that the Route 460 projects could compete for smart scale funding. And that was year 7 funding. And so we continue to see that need through the smart scale program. And possibly others as grant opportunities, as Mr. Chairman mentioned earlier, that there may be these opportunities to conditionally commit funds for year 7. And since the STBG program accepts applications every other year, it lends itself to looking at that 7th year.
So just for clarification, by eliminating the reference to the first 2 years in that provision, which kind of was the rule of thumb with the these policies before, as long as it appears anywhere in the plan within the 7 years, it will stay unless and does not have to recompete, even if it were to be reallocated pursuant to some other procedure. Is that the intent of eliminating the reference to the first 2 years, or am I misreading that?
Well, Mr. Osborne, in the last couple financial plans, we've been showing a column that states how much is committed funding and another column that shows how much is conditionally committed funding. And then the financial plan shows when those allocations would be made. And so we didn't want to fix, a time frame to the funding. It's committed whenever the funding is available within the 6 years. And if adjustments need to be made, it's still that same committed amount unless the project were to come back to the board for an increase in funding.
So this change is just acknowledging what a change that has already been made previously in our policy by changing it. I mean, it used to be that committed funding was defined by the fact that it received funding in the first 2 years. That's what made it committed funding, is my understanding. We're taking that qualification out. We're now going to describe it initially as either committed or conditional. And if it's committed, then it stays in the plan. And even if it's reallocated in some way through a later procedure to a different year. Am I
Correct.
understanding that correctly?
Yes.
And if it's only showing up as funding, for example, in years 5, 6, and 7 of this 7th plan, it's still committed and does not have to go through reallocation again.
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, if there are no other questions on policy number 4, I can move on to number 5. Okay, policy number 5 it deals with those adjustments to the year of expenditure. And so what we've written in here was that any adjustments would be made in accordance with the Transportation Improvement Program adjustment procedures, and that the coordination would only be required with project sponsors, that this removes the need for the staff to come and get approval of the technical committee and VDOT and have the extra coordination that wouldn't allow for maybe the quick changes that would be necessary, so that the TTC wouldn't have to hold a special meeting in the same way that the board held a special meeting last November. So the Transportation Improvement Program is a public document. We keep it updated on our website, and all of those adjustments would be reflected on the website for anybody to see at any time. So we would continue to work with VDOT because we often get requests from VDOT to make administrative changes to funding of projects. And if they're in accordance with the Transportation Improvement Program, then it doesn't need to come to the board or have any kind of other public input. So it would just be handled similarly. But of course, even a dollar change to any of the project total amounts, conditional or committed, would come back to the board for approval. Are there any questions on number 5?
So just again, for clarification, the TIP procedures, which you're saying we're now using, you referred to administrative adjustments. So what is an administrative adjustment, and what is that? What other types of adjustments are there? And you referred to any dollar amount as not being administrative. So that I think I understand. But what is an administrative adjustment?
So it would mainly fall under, and it's described, administrative modifications versus amendments are described in the Transportation Improvement Program. Amendments require a full-blown public input process. They include scope changes, significant changes to the cost. Now, this procedure here takes that a step further in that any change to the dollar amount would have to be brought back to the board, whereas the Transportation Improvement Program gives greater funding allowances for other projects. So this mainly is concerned with changes to the year of expenditure of funds. So if money has to get moved either forward or backward in order to accommodate project schedules or grant program funding requirements or whatever it might be, those are administrative changes that we could change the year of expenditure with the consent of the project sponsors. So if it's a locality project manager or a VDOT project manager, we would be coordinating with them to make sure that they're comfortable with the changes that have been requested. And that request may come from VDOT, may come from a locality. Various folks may come up with the request to make a change. So does that answer your question?
Christina?
Yes.
This is Phil here. That change, if I understand this correctly, was driven in part because of this reason for the special called meeting, which VDOT counseled us on moving some funds around to help improve the potential success and scoring of a project. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And so this will make it a lot more fluid and easier to effect without calling special meetings.
Yes.
To meet these the guidance and deadlines that VDOT was counseling us.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I could.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so to Mr. North, to further that, just the simple fact that the money that's allocated in a particular year to a project may have, for instance, it's tied to a fiscal year, right? So it'll be federal dollars fiscal year 2017. Well, it's very common that we work with our federal partners and they're looking at the flushing out and the closing out, if you will, of those prior year dollars. So if we have a project, take the Greenway at the Foundry, that had a planned execution schedule that got interrupted because they had challenges with getting the right of way, we may have had money on that project that was, say, 2017 as an example. Well, obviously it didn't spend the money in 2017 because, you know, the project didn't advance as expected in terms of schedule. So in that situation, we've got other projects that are spending dollars. So what we're essentially going to be working with is trying to shift and change the year of that money from being 2017 dollars to, say, the Foundry project. We would make that 2020 or 21 dollars. And then another project that's actually active and spending money, we shift that 2017 money to go ahead and get it spent. So it's an administrative and financial accounting of the dollars within the various fiscal years. That's a very common administrative adjustment that's taken place both at VDOT, you know, we do that administratively outside of the CTB's actual involvement per se, under a similar type of delegated authority with the administrative functions to basically administratively manage the money and close things out by fiscal year.
Mr. King, it means, so this can be done as long as the total amount of the project, right?
That's correct.
Doesn't change. And the project sponsor has to be in agreement with it as well.
Yeah, and most of the time the project sponsor, it should have no effect. We do oftentimes though also deal with, this would be less applicable to the STBG funding that we get, but broader when you get over into the VDOT funding overall, we have different types of funding. So we'll have funding that's bridge funding. So sometimes we'll be shifting money around where a project maybe didn't have bridge money on it, but it actually involved the construction of a bridge. You know, we'll be shifting money to go ahead and spend out maybe some FY 2017 bridge funds. It's an appropriate and eligible expenditure, and it helps financially close out the funds that we were allocated to the Commonwealth and keeps our books in order. So we do a lot of administrative moves of the color and type of money. In this case, this is a very similar example, but that will probably be more focused solely on the fiscal year of the dollars themselves and not necessarily different types of funding. But yes.
Thank you.
The only concerns that I would, I guess, express is that we don't control those TIP procedures. And normally this process is not subject to the TIP procedures. And so it may make more sense for us to either just say in a manner similar to rather than in accordance with, or to actually spell out the procedures that we're describing and adopt the language regarding administrative changes that is in the TIP procedures, so that if TIP does change those procedures at some point, we don't, you know, we're not stuck with what they may change them to based on our own policies. And I realize that we can change this at the time if we need to. The other concern that I would have is just to make sure that even though they're administrative in nature, this thing ought to expressly provide that those, even though the policy board approval is not required, that they are reported to the policy board whenever they're made. And again, we can assume that that would happen. But since we're spelling out procedures and adjusting them, it would make sense to me that it should clearly state that.
So, Mr. Osborne, the Transportation Improvement Program that's referenced is actually the RVTPO's Transportation Improvement Program. It is the 4-year document that lists all of the TPO's federally funded projects. And the last one was updated and adopted by the TPO last June. And so it is the board's document, and you have the ability to change it at any time. So, and the administrative modifications and amendment process is something that has been around since the TIP has been around. And we regularly work with VDOT on making those TIP amendments and adjustments. And if you'll recall, even a year ago when we amended into the TIP, the I-81 widening projects, we went through a public involvement process because that was such a significant project. And that's what the TIP called for, was to have that level of involvement with stakeholders. So that is the document that houses all of the federally funded projects that are funded for the RVTPO region. And the STBG procedures are reflected in an appendix in the TIP document. So this rolls up into all of the other funding programs that are covered under the region's Transportation Improvement Program.
So you're saying we could choose to eliminate the public hearing requirements that are for the TIP if we wanted to?
Well, interestingly enough, the next item on the agenda is to discuss the TPO's public participation plan. So, but there are some items that are required really to have public involvement. Long-range plan, transportation improvement program, these are the main reasons why the TPO exists, is to create these plans and programs. So we can look at that a little bit more when we discuss the public participation plan.
Yeah. Christina, I have a question for clarification. Back on page 20, we went over the changes to number 4. And then I note on page 21 below number 5 is number 6. And that statement reads pretty short and to the point. The RVTPO Policy Board strongly advises no STBG application constitute more than 2 years of funding. I just noticed this and I'm asking the question, and that is, does this conflict with number 4? And if so, how can we mitigate that conflict?
Mr. North, I don't believe that policy number 6 is in conflict at all with policy number 4. This one, policy number 6, really references that no single project should consume too much of the STBG funding. So the equivalent roughly of 2 years worth of funding.
Okay, thank you.
That's referring to the total allocation, correct?
Correct, yes. Okay.
All right, any more discussion?
I can move on to the last one, Mr. Chair.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. The last one is policy number 9 that has some recommended changes. However, since the agenda packet was published, the language that is in policy number 9 that was revised has been further looked at. And Mr. King has had a number of conversations with folks and has some replacement language really for the board to consider. And I managed on Eddie's computer to get to my email, and so I can share my screen here that shows that language. So is that large enough? Okay. Okay, so policy number 9 talks about the conditional committed funding and what projects are allowed to ask for conditional commitment funding in order to pursue the remaining funds through other sources. So originally it was limited to projects that were in the 2018 regional study on transportation project prioritization for economic development and growth. It was realized very quickly that there was too limiting that list of projects. There were 10 projects listed. Several of those were I-81 projects, which were funded through other sources. And same with some of the other projects, they were seeking other sources. And so what we found in the last round was that there were a number of other project priorities that the localities had that were submitted for STBG funding that were desiring that same level of consideration for conditional committed STBG funds in order to secure the remaining funds through Smart Scale particularly. So this policy looked to modify that. And while there was some concern about the original suggested language that are deemed a priority, so candidate projects that are deemed a priority seem to be too broad on the other hand. So Mr. King had gone back and talked with some folks and tried to get some suggested language that would lend itself to still wanting to have some priorities predefined, that only projects that would fall in line with those priorities would be eligible for this conditional commitment funding, but not specify it too much as what had been done previously, which was outdated too quickly. So Mr. King, do you have any more that you would like to share regarding this new proposed language?
Well, yeah, I think what you saw in the agenda packet was really an effort to, previously it made reference to the specific 2018 TED study. And obviously, that would have to be updated over time as that, as we went by in time from 2018 to a next study and the like. And so the effort was to kind of deal with that in somewhat of a more generic manner. But in making those edits, we really took out, a lot of language to the point that it was felt that it didn't adequately put in context that we do want to still try to maintain, the identification of top priorities. And so this revised language tries to get at that, certainly sharing that we're going to maintain a list or the TPO will maintain a list of top priority projects, such as a top 10. It could be a top 8 or 12, or, but there is a focus. I know that I had a good conversation with Mr. North about how helpful he viewed that both when he came on to the TPO board as a board member, and also in interactions that took place with various community leaders. I know that Dr. Smoot, our current CTB member, made comment of the fact of how nice it was to get that, because it does help him understand what are the main priorities for the Roanoke Valley. And so I think the intent was not to necessarily take away or suggest that not continue. So this language is kind of shared to put back into place the fact that we are going to try to maintain a top 10 list in similar format and structure as what we've went through in the previous TED study efforts. And then, but also addressing the problem of just because something wasn't specifically referenced in the TED study doesn't mean that it's not a regional priority that we could also give some consideration of conditionally funding for. So that's this second sentence that talks about additional regional priorities. Projects and initiatives beyond the top priorities may also be listed and recognized as regional priorities. And then ultimately, each of those that are consistent with those established regional priorities certainly could be programmed in the financial plan with conditionally committed money to leverage, whether it be smart scale or other types of fund sources to bring about the full funding of the project through construction. So I think based on the coordination I've had with Mr. North and Mr. Radford and others, I think this still achieves the original intent of the edit that was there, while preserving, the fact that we do want to maintain a focus on a very useful communication and marketing kind of element of the top 10 or top priority list. So.
Thank you, Mr. King. In front of the board, you have a resolution to approve the changes that have been presented to you. Of course, this new language would replace the language that was originally presented in the staff report. So we are hoping to have action on that today. We are in the process of updating the STBG financial plan for the years FY 22 through 27, or potentially FY 22 through 28 if the policies are approved today. So I'll leave it to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, has everyone had, I hope everyone's had a chance to review the resolution. I will entertain a motion to approve this if I could get one from someone in the meeting.
Move the resolution.
Who made the motion?
Councilmember Stephanie Moon Reynolds.
Okay, thank you. Do I hear a second?
Second,
And that's Mr. Phil North.
it is. Thank you.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Mr. Secretary, we'll take a roll call vote. Mr. Strickland?
Someone told me today, Mr. Chairman, that you should be fined every time you don't unmute yourself. And I said I'd be broke after a while. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Martin?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Jeffrey?
Yes.
Ms. Moon Reynolds?
Yes.
Mr. Fidgelowski?
Yes.
Mr. North?
Yes,
Mr. Radford?
Yes.
Mayor Turk?
She gave the thumbs up.
Okay, Mr. Stovall? Mr. Stovall? Mr. King?
Yes.
Mr. Price?
Yes.
Mr. Sonnenklar?
Yes.
Okay.
What's going on?
Motion passes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Christine, I see one error on this resolution.
Okay.
Down at the bottom, you've got my name, you've got Billy W. Martin Jr. It should be senior.
All right.
Thank you, sir. I apologize for the error.
No, that's no problem. Okay.
Thank you also to Mr. King and Mr. Radford for their work on this.
Yes, thank you,
Appreciate
gentlemen.
that.
Do you have anything else, Ms. Finch?
No, I don't.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Agenda item number 5, we have a draft update to the public participation plan, which is on pages 35 through 45, and Rachel Rulin will be making this presentation. Rachel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The public participation plan was first adopted in 2007, and it had its first major update in 2018. So that update included a provision to review it every 3 years so that it wouldn't go more than 10 years without another update, and adjust it as needed. So we're on schedule for that. And we made a number of fairly minor revisions that's in the staff report. Those are listed out. I just want to point out a couple. One is a clarification. We're required by state law to take out newspaper ads for a final comment period or a public hearing. And newspaper ads are expensive and ineffective. So we just wanted to clarify that if the state law changes, then we won't require ourselves to continue doing that. The other change I wanted to point out is making the 15-day minimum comment period is now 14 days. A lot of our comment periods are longer than 15 days. That's just the minimum. If there's something fairly minor and routine, we don't necessarily need anything longer than that. The reason for changing it from 15 to 14 is because the schedule just didn't work between our meetings and when newspaper ads are due. So if the technical committee reviewed this draft and gave us some feedback, which was incorporated into the draft that you all are seeing. And if this draft is okay with you, we will open it up for the 45-day public comment period. This is the one document that requires quite a bit longer. It's required to have a long comment period. And that's a federal law that requires that. So we anticipate this would come back to you in April, and that would be when the public hearing would be. Related, or at the same time that we were reviewing the plan itself, we also reviewed our public participation efforts over the past couple of years and wrote up a report for you that's also in the agenda packet. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things out of that report. The one strategy that has had the greatest impact on our publication or public input process is we now routinely use surveys for kind of everything. So in the past, we would have some document, we'd say, this is the comment period, and here's the document, and you can email us your comments. And we got very few, if any, comments. Well, now, in addition to saying, here's the document, we also say, and take a survey, where we might only ask a couple of yes or no questions and provide a comment box, but just having, to click a couple buttons and then answer a couple questions and then having the opportunity for comment, people give lots of comments. So we've achieved our objective of quantity. Also, many of those comments are actually relevant to the topic of the survey. So we've also achieved, we've had a lot of improvements in the quality of input that we're getting. Now that we're getting quite a lot of experience in making surveys, we've learned a lot about surveys. And one of the lessons I wanted to mention that we've learned is using words and phrases that people can understand. So when agencies write a project title or a project description, sometimes that's intended for internal use. and nobody else can understand that. Not us and not the general public. Well, that's a problem then if we're asking them, well, what do you think of this project? But we can't explain what the project is. So one of the objectives, one of the 4 objectives of our public input is that the experience be meaningful to the people providing the input. And so obviously they can't provide meaningful input if they can't understand the questions. So we have learned we need to translate some of these things into public friendly language, and that takes time. So that was a big lesson for us. Then I also wanted to mention, so the 4th objective for our public participation, so we've got quantity, quality, and meaningful experience. The other objective is that we want to get input from a variety of perspectives. That can mean like geographical representation, it can mean demographic, and I'm actually really proud of our our achievements in our public input in all of these, in the quantity, and then in this like getting into this Title VI and this diversity of feedback that we're getting, or diversity of perspectives. So we've achieved really great success with the geographical responses. We could take out Facebook ads. These are much less expensive than newspaper ads and far more effective. And so we can take out these Facebook ads that target specific zip codes. And then we ask people for their zip code, and about 80% of them will tell us their zip code. And then we can compare that to what proportion of the population lives in this zip code and what proportion of the people who have responded come from this zip code. And then the next week, we continue the ads to those zip codes that we're not hearing from. And we do that iteratively. And so using that strategy, we've had a couple of surveys now that we got the proportion of responses from every zip code was within 5% of their proportion of the population. So that was exciting. Of course, the other demographic group that we're really trying to do better at reaching, in some of our earlier surveys, we might have 500, as many as 500 people respond, and one of them might identify themselves as African American. So when our population is 14% African American, that's not very good. So we've tried a number of things. Some things didn't work very well, but the one strategy that's worked very well is we have an email list. So every time we do a survey, we ask people to share their email address. Not a lot of people do, but some do. And when they do, we add their email to a list. And next time we have a survey, we will send a notification of the survey to that list. We've got about 300 people on that list, and we get 25 to 30% response rate from that list. So that's a very high response rate for surveys. Well, we've started proactively asking African Americans if we can add them to this email list. And that has been very effective at improving our response rate to where, you know, from maybe 1 in 500 to where we're now up to like 6%, which is still a lot less than 14%, but that represents about maybe 13 or 14 individuals. So we have a long ways to go, but we made great progress there.
And you have these, Rachel, the transportation equity chats as
That
well.
was the last thing I wanted to mention.
Yeah.
That we're very proud of that we did. So of course we couldn't do a lot of in-person things this year. So we did these transportation equity chats, those virtual events. We had the local transportation advocate, Antoine Calloway, interview the guests. We called them transportation equity chats. The first chat was about urban renewal, but after that, it was more about this: what are opportunities for public input, and how is public input used? How do people get involved, and then what happens when you do get involved? So those were really exciting, and I thought they turned out very, very well. I think they reached a pretty good number of people. And we still have those videos on our YouTube channel, actually, and also on our Facebook page. Our Facebook page. So that's all I have, and so we're just looking for direction to open up the draft plan for the 45-day public comment period.
Okay, any questions for Rachel? Now we have another resolution that we need to approve too. Is that right? On this?
This we're just looking for a directive for us to advertise.
Oh,
They're just
okay. That's, oh, that's,
requesting-
it's not dated. I'm sorry. Okay. Do you have anything else, Rachel?
That's all. Thank you.
Any questions for Rachel? Okay, if not, thank you, Rachel. We'll go to agenda item number.
Mr. Martin,
yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
we
sir.
probably have to have action directing the staff to advertise this draft public participation plan.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
So we
Okay,
need a vote on it.
Yeah, we need a motion to approve staff to advertise this resolution and this action. Do I hear a motion out there?
So moved.
Okay, and that is who?
Councilmember Stephanie Moon Reynolds.
Okay, and who made the second?
Robert Jeffrey seconded.
Who?
Mr. Jeffrey.
Seconded.
Okay, okay. All right, then we'll take a roll call vote.
Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Martin,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Jeffrey,
Yes.
Ms. Moon Reynolds,
Yes.
Mr. Fidgelowski,
Yes.
Mr. North,
Yes.
Mr. Radford,
Yes.
and Mayor Turk,
Yes.
Mr. Stovall. Mr. Stovall. Okay. Mr. King,
Yes.
Mr. Price,
Yes.
Mr. Sonnenklar.
Yeah. Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you, sir. And
I'm
Thank
sorry,
you
Mr.
both.
Chairman, Mr. Clinton has joined us.
I vote yes. I
All
vote
right.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
hello, Mr. Clinton.
Hello, Mr. Martin. How are you, sir?
There you, sir. Okay, at this point, we'll go to other business. And agenda item number 6. Eddie Wells will be giving that presentation for us.
Mr. Chairman, just a short update on our economic development and transportation study, what we had previously called this TED study. As most of you know, Christina and I have been working with a economic development stakeholders group for the past few months. We've had a couple of meetings with the group itself. We've also had individual meetings with most of the stakeholders. Completed those back in December, just after the actually just the week after the TPO meeting, combined meeting in December. Since that time, we've been.
I'm not sure I understand it, but I'll call you back. Okay, bye-bye.
Since that time, we've been reviewing the input, so clarifying the needs and concerns that we've heard from the economic development staff and the other stakeholders. Christina's been working on categorizing, big word, categorizing the needs that we've heard from the economic development staff. We're trying to get those listed into priorities before we share them with the TTC next month.
When I get through with this.
We met with them earlier today, actually at 9 o'clock this morning. We went over a list of needs to make sure that we understood everything that they had told us and make sure that we didn't miss anything during those 2 group meetings and all those individual meetings. We've asked them to come back and send us their top 10 priorities off of the list. Currently, right now, there's I think the needs were probably 6 or 7 pages that we presented to them this morning. They did clarify some items that were on the list. We've talked a little bit about all different modes of transportation, from airport, I-81, sidewalks, greenways, a little bit of everything that has been brought up that they can relate to economic development. Plan on having that presented to the TTC at their March 11th meeting. At that time, we plan on sort of turning it over to the transportation folks that know a lot more about, I guess designing the projects and addressing each of these needs and determining what the problems are and what can and can't be done for each of them. after the TTC has it for March and probably at their April meeting again too, we're going to present a draft of the update to the TPO in May. That will give you all a chance to look at it and consider the economic development needs along with the rest of the long range transportation planning needs. I think at this time, looking at rolling all those in sort of together, but still making sure that those economic development needs are addressed. So that's sort of where we're at right now. If anyone has any questions or comments or anything on that. I apologize for the computers switching back and forth with Christina and I. We got a laptop that's decided it's not going to work this afternoon, so we're sort of sharing one.
So Eddie, let me ask a question, Mr. Chairman, of Mr. Wells. Eddie, so next month at the TPO meeting, you're going to have a product for us as a result of all these stakeholders and economic development people's input. Is that correct? Is that what I heard you say?
My understanding is that we're going to send it to the TTC first, so they get a shot at actually, you know, some of the needs we're identifying are sort of, I don't want to say they're general, but we haven't asked for specific projects because we feel that that's probably the role of the TTC to, you know, if somebody wants to, I'll use traffic congestion along Orange Avenue just as the example. You know, that's, you know, the need is to reduce the congestion along Orange Avenue. You know, we're not going to decide what the best project or the best way to do that is. You know, that's up to the transportation planners and BDOT and the TTC to sort of figure out the best way to address that. And then with the idea that once TTC addresses it, it goes to the TPO. You guys set the policies. You decide what the priorities are, what should be funded. You know, how these are going to be meshed in with the, I guess, with the long range transportation plan, and what should actually be done out of this long list of sort of general needs that have been identified.
So what I hear you saying is the TDCC will get this next month. Is that?
Yes, sir.
And then we will get it when at the TPO policy board in April? Or does that depend on the TDCC?
It may depend on how long the TTC looks at it. If they initially just get it next month, and you know, next month being March the 11th, I don't know that they're going to be able to. I don't know if it's reasonable of us to ask them to come up with a list of projects to address all these things at one meeting. I think once they get the initial list and get a chance to look at it, think about it, come back in May with those projects.
But could it happen that the TTC, if it's working, get it done by their April meeting, which and then a draft of potential projects be sent to the TPO board the end of April?
The end of April.
End of April.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's probably doable, and that might actually be better if they get a draft in the end of April, and then everybody can sort of have a final version that everyone has seen for those May meetings, and then that sort of be a finalized. And hopefully all this will mesh well with the long range transportation plan schedule. So we'll see how that goes.
So it seems like the 7 or 8 pages of projects and initiatives will be reduced to a smaller amount once the folks on your stakeholders team provides the top 10 each.
Yes, that's what we're hoping for. Yes.
Okay, good.
So that'll give yeah, each of the localities, you know, we're fortunate that each of the localities staff has been at some of the meetings. You know, I think everyone, I think all the local governments that are in the MPO area, including Bedford and Montgomery, have had somebody at least one of the meetings. So we have gotten input from the economic development folks from everyone, and that's been really good. And you know, they're getting this opportunity to come back and give us their sort of 10 priorities, and then you know, we're going to figure out how to sort of combine those into an overall 10 priorities for the region. You know, that I'm going to say that's not going to be, that doesn't have to be the final 10 priorities. I mean, once the TTC gets it, you know, they may see something that just doesn't seem reasonable from either a financial or a design point, and they can certainly make the change then. If there are needs that are identified, we've sort of gone around and around about talking about, pedestrian and greenways and bicycle needs, and is that all one need or those separate needs? Sort of the same thing with the highways. Is a crossover and access point the same as widening a road? Those are, while they may address the same point or the same corridor, those are two totally different projects that address different needs. So it's going to be hard for some of the economic development folks, I think, to pick out 10 projects. And that may be difficult for us to pick out 10 too, as a staff. I mean, I'm glad we're not the ones doing it, to be honest with you.
If these are the same projects that I remember seeing on the SEDS committee, I can appreciate the reduction from those 7 or 8 pages down to what really is important.
Those we have seen. I will give Roanoke County's economic development staff credit for that. They have sent in some changes to the comprehensive economic development strategy list, which we're going to review with that committee next week. And they have reduced, what was 30, 35 transportation projects down to more like 20, because they've combined some things. The I-81's not 5 or 6 projects; it's an I-81 corridor project. So it's a little bit easier for us to read, and also probably for the public to read. So
thank you for your good work in this regard.
You're welcome. Any other questions or anything? I think that's all I had. We weren't going. There's no action item or anything for this. I can't hear Mr. Martin.
Mr. Chairman, we can't hear you. Mr. Chairman, I don't think you're muted. I don't see that muted sign on your.
He could have unplugged his mic.
Right. Could have. That's true.
He's there, but he's not. He's I think he realizes he's trying to fix it.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Vice Chairman, do you want to?
Okay, I'll go ahead. Mr. Chairman, I'm gonna go ahead and since we can't hear you, if that's, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, we'll proceed. Thank you. So are there any more comments for any wells or questions? Okay, with that said, let's move on to item number 7, comment period by the RVTPO policy board members and or the public. Do you have any comments from the public, Mr. Strickland?
No, Mr. Vice Chairman, I did have a couple of things, and the first one isn't just a comment. The second one is a question for Mr. King. There's been a lot about the census process over the last year or so, but they are kind of, concluding the census, and the numbers, local governments and states will be getting their numbers, I guess, in the next few months. But we have been getting notes from not only highway-related offices, but other offices, that the census is proposing to redefine what a metropolitan area is. At this point, in terms of its population base and so forth, that will affect 6 metropolitan areas in Virginia. I believe it's Lynchburg. It may also affect Harrisonburg and the Stanton area, Winchester in that area. That won't affect us, but they're also proposing to redefine what an urban area is. Now, that could have an impact on us, because if the urban area ties into what we call the urbanized area, that defines the boundary for the TPO service area. And so the last time we had the census, because our urbanized area expanded into Montgomery County and Bedford, Montgomery County and Bedford became a member of the TPO. if they redefine it, and they're talking about going from a population area of 2,500, no, I'm sorry, 4,000 down to 2,500, that may have an impact on us in the future. I just wanted to make you aware of that, and we'll keep you abreast of the possibility of that altering our service area for the TPO. The second point I had, question I had, and this is for Mr. King. So do we have any projects that could be accommodated by this infra funding? I mean, one thing I thought about was, and I don't know if it's ready yet, the Peters Creek Road interchange. I mean, you can get 25 million plus for a project. Is that something that we are ready to look at as a project?
Well, the infra grant is very similar to the previous, Tiger grant and the like. And, so within VDOT's identification of Tiger grants, infra grants, and the like, that's usually guided by the administration. So the secretary identifies that. So consequently, we, at the local district usually stay, ready for that telephone call that might come that we're to help with helping craft. And we have done that before with efforts. We actually had some efforts on applications for I-81 in the last kind of round of the infra and the like. I haven't been notified of anything of late that's going to spin up from the department in our area, but I know Michael Gray, I believe, is on the call here. Michael, could you speak to anything that either that you've heard or the fact that you haven't heard, like myself? Michael? I see Michael out there, but I don't see him unmuting, so I may have, anyway. So Wayne, actually, to answer, I don't, at least it hasn't come across my, a screen yet that we've got something that we're working to try to advance. In terms of what I will say that what I would anticipate, when you pay attention to what's going on at the federal level in terms of infrastructure bill and infrastructure focus, certainly there's a very strong multimodal urban focus type strategies and initiatives. So, that lends itself for, if you think about, we do have the passenger rail, added service that's being talked about and ways through which you could review possible strategies for application in that manner might be something that I would guide to consider, because I do think that's going to be a real focus area of the federal program as I have been kind of reading and observing, and there's some ways to certainly capitalize on that. But from the department's development of applications and projects, the governor usually advances two, no more than 3 of those statewide, and so there'll be more to come on that. If I hear of what we've got developed, I'll certainly let you know.
So in the TPO would have to have the governor's concurrence, I assume, to move forward.
No, actually, that is taken. You certainly can make application from the TPO or from the local area. What we have done in the last several rounds is the department can certainly offer, comments and help guide information and things of that nature. I don't think that we have, it dates back a good while since we've provided letters of endorsement, because in a way, that is somewhat in competition for what what is really the governor's initiatives that he's pushing for. So we support the information and the development process and things of that nature. We just stop short of any kind of resolutions or letters of support. So
okay, thank you.
Yeah, Ken, this is Michael. If y'all can hear me now.
Yeah, we can hear you now, Michael.
Sorry, I had to unmute twice, and I have nothing else to offer other than I'm in the same boat with you. I haven't heard anything coming from central office related to that grant opportunity or any initiative coming out of the secretary's office.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Anybody else got any comments, board members? I'll go ahead then. I have been appointed to the Transportation Steering Committee of National Counties, which is going to have a virtual meeting starting on March 8th. In fact, the whole month of March, they have meetings on and off with different steering committees. But transportations comes up on March 8th and for a couple of hours, and they're going to have speakers and resolutions and so forth. If there's anything gleaning comes out of that, I'll be glad to share at the next TPO meeting. Anyone else a member of NACO or plans on being on the virtual call? Okay. Are there any comments from any of our policy board members? Okay, with that said, then, Mr. Strickland, if there's no further comments, I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
Burke, I move to adjourn.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, Ms. Turk made a motion to adjourn, seconded by Stephanie Moon Reynolds. Thank you, ladies.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Mr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Clinton,
Yes.
Mr. Martin. Well, I'm not sure Mr. Martin's still with us. So.
I think gone.
Mr. Jeffrey,
Yes.
Ms. Moon Reynolds,
Yes.
Mr. Fidgelowski,
Yes.
Mr. North,
Yes.
Mr. Radford,
Yes.
Mayor Turk,
Yes.
Mr. Stovall. I'm sure Mr. Stovall's with us. Mr. King,
Yes.
Mr. Price,
Yes.
Mr. Sonneklaar.
Yes.
Motion passes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. With that said, everyone have a great rest of the day, and be seeing you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.